It's past 8, and yeah, we'll be switching gears, I think, to the biggest story, the biggest headline in South Africa, and I think the continent. It was supposed to be a diplomatic reset. Instead, it became a global spectacle, part strategy, part confrontation, and dare I say, a masterclass in come under fire from President Cyril Ramaphosa. Yesterday, our country's president stood his ground in the most politically charged room on earth, the Oval Office. If you're watching, US President Donald Trump reignited the explosive claim of a white Afrikaner genocide in South Africa. It became the it topic. It was live before a global audience, before a world media. And it was, as a South African, watching all of that unfold, man, I was left with an uneasiness because we know the realities is on the ground. We understand what's going on here. So, from golf legends to genocide accusations, from data-driven diplomacy to deliberate provocation, today on News and Views will be unpacking what happened behind the diplomatic curtain. Is this the beginning of a renewed partnership or a fractured facade between South Africa and the US? And we'll be unpacking that and a whole lot more with leading international affairs analyst, Professor Gilbert Khadiagala, to help us dissect that high drama, high octane, and high consequence meeting between Donald Trump and South African President Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa. Professor is joining us via our virtual platform. Prof, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Salam Media. Really appreciate you giving us your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Sir Alon.
There's so much information, there's so much analysis, there's people trying to decode certain language, trying to decode body language, but from your perspective, from what you saw yesterday, coming out of the Oval Office, how would you say Cyril Ramaphosa did when it comes to presenting South Africa's case to a world superpower and the leader of the free world, Donald Trump?
I think President Ramaphosa did a good job last night. It was polite, but it was a firm response to the accusations that came out of the White House. But I also want to say from the beginning, I think the South African delegation as a whole did succeed, one, in surviving. You remember that they were expected to be ambushed and they were expected to be expelled from the White House and called all kinds of names. But that element of the diplomacy was, to me, very interesting, that you had a confrontation, but it had to be there. That confrontation was expected because this has been Donald Trump's narrative for the last 4 months, that there is white genocide happening in South Africa. South Africa is not a friendly country. South Africa has moved away from its non-aligned status of working with all countries. Now it's working more with countries such as Russia and Iran, and it has not taken the US interests very seriously. So I think the objective of the meeting was largely fulfilled, which was to go to Washington and confront Donald Trump and listen to what accusations he was going to bring to the table. Respond to these accusations, but don't shout, don't be defensive. Try to stay on the message, on the positive message, which was South Africa remains a friend of the United States. South Africa has deep internal issues, but South Africa is also a constitutional democracy where you have all voices making a contribution to the national debates. So when you talk about the EFF or the MK coming up with all these statements about whites, about, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, This has been largely a part of what you call a democratic dispensation. South Africa is not an authoritarian state. So Trump or anybody else cannot expect some of these noises to disappear just because the state is
Mm,
going to use its power to impose its vision of what you call racial equality or racial harmony. So these are issues that the delegation, I think, was trying to put across. And
mm,
it was very good that President Ramaphosa took the leadership of really calming down the waters and not confronting Trump. Because the problem, you remember, is Mr. Zelensky from Ukraine is that he overreacted to some of Trump's accusations. I think it
mm.
was confrontational because he was ambushed by the Vice President J.D. Vance. Fortunately, J.D. Vance was in the meeting last night, but he didn't say anything. So I think it was a
that
good.
that that was good. That was good for me because we know how provocative he can be, the language that he uses. But Prof, you talk about Cyril Ramaphosa being quite diplomatic, not being reactive to some of the accusations that were made by President Trump. Coming home, I'm scrolling through social media, and some of the leaders, some really powerful and influential voices in South Africa call this a tragedy. What do you call diplomacy? They call it a tragedy. They're saying it looks like a house nigger, if I can use that
Yeah.
proverbial colloquial, who went to his slave master to an imperial power, cap in hand, and sitting at the corner like a naughty school child, being shown everything that is doing wrong on the screen, and he didn't show strength. There was no show of leadership from President Cyril Ramaphosa. He didn't show, the power and a big voice that was expected of him. And I'm thinking to myself, that's not justified, especially knowing the character that is Donald Trump and what you're dealing with. What do you say to those that say this was embarrassing? It took Africa 100 years back, essentially.
No, I agree. I can understand the sentiment, but I actually don't agree because literally what Ramaphosa and the group were, they were in a lion's den, and you have to survive the lion's den by trying to come up with all kinds of tricks that would make the lion much more saner, much more sober,
Mm,
because you want to put your message across. So I think overreaction to Trump's accusations would have been a disaster for the delegation. I think they needed to be polite. They were well prepared. Maybe not as well prepared on the issue of the videos.
mm,
They knew that there were going to be accusations of genocide and all that, but probably the videos and the newspaper cuttings and so on took them a bit of a little bit by surprise. But it was still the same message. My point is that South Africa wanted to begin to re-engage with the United States. And who is in the White House right now? You have Mr. Trump. And we know what Mr. Trump is all about. We know that he can be mercurial. We know that he can be unpredictable. So he had to be handled very gingerly. The responses by President Ramaphosa, I think, was excellent because he took the leadership. And then, of course, when Trump began to invite the golfers and Johan Rupert, I think it also made the situation much easier for the discussion to flow. Even though it was a confrontational discussion, it was important that you have these other actors who are not part of the South African government, but they played a very important role in humanizing Trump, if we can put it that way, in
mm,
making him much more sober, much more understanding. So the president's job was made much easier. by the very fact that you had other voices, and of course, when he did invite Lungisa from the trade union, I
Mm,
think it was important that you have very many voices that were going to respond to most of these accusations. But if it
mm.
was just simply the two of them or a government to government delegation, I think it would have been a disaster.
No, definitely. Prof, how much of this exercise was uh good for South Africa's own internal affairs? Because I think for the first time we were forced to dissect, we were forced to look with the microscope the realities of what's happening in our own country, and to a large extent the failures of our government in the past 30 years of democracy. I think what came out really strong, especially in the latter end of that discussion in the Oval Office, was the issue of crime and how it has been allowed
Yeah,
to get out of hand. It was the issues of our porous borders. It was the issue of unemployment, which is very, very high among South Africa's
yeah,
youth. How much of that do you think the president? Because let's be honest, our politicians can be out of touch sometimes, and
yeah,
it was almost the first time when they actually sat on the chair and someone showed you what the whole world sees. Because when you are inside the eye of the storm, you can't see what's happening outside and the damage
yeah.
that's actually happening. So, how much of this exercise can South Africa and the leadership that we have be taken and be used to better the country? Because there was some gruesome stuff at some point. I was cringing that Miss Losi from the trade unions was talking about older women's throats being slit, and old
Mm,
women being repeatedly raped and women being killed in front of international media. And I'm
yeah.
saying, oh my God, no one is going to want to come to South Africa after this. But how much of this exercise is in my language Sepedi, ba re to smell your armpits and
Yeah.
do something about it.
No, you're accurate. This is what we call washing dirty linen in public.
True.
But it was a good moment to wash South Africa's dirty linen in the White House
Not
with,
for a lot
with,
of South Africans, trust me.
with an international audience
Oh my God.
listening and watching. Because I think these debates have been part of the political landscape here. Issues around crime, issues about unemployment, issues around inequality, but getting at these issues through a negative lens of accusations of genocide, I think it opened up the debate. Even people like Johan Rupert coming up and responding with their personal experiences. But the personal experiences that simply reinforce the message that all these problems are there, but we are trying to deal with them because we can't just sit and complain. We have unemployment, we have violence against women. All these are bigger issues that South Africans are discussing every day. The fact that they're being aired in public, internationally, the embarrassing component of it, as you're saying, I mean,
Mm,
most people felt very uncomfortable, particularly some of the statements that came out. But the other thing I also want to say before I finish my point is that a lot of these people were not prepared to speak.
mm,
And so they were really innovating, they're improvising. And so you could see, I mean, even people like Annie Els are a bit nervous. And some of them were not as coherent. Even the agriculture minister wasn't as coherent. But it was expected because you've just been asked in the Oval
mm,
Office to speak and make a presentation that is going to be coherent. But they improvised and they did a good job. So the issues they raised, I think, were issues that were trying to deflect from that negative message of a genocide. It was not purely a confrontation around genocide. It was now a bigger discussion about what are some of the bigger problems that ail South Africa, and how have they been, in fact, how have they played themselves out over the years, and what are the solutions to these problems? And I think that's the message the President Ramaphosa was trying to put to the table. All these problems are soluble if you have investment, if you have external, if you have American engagement. All these issues can be resolved if there is a big consensus that, in fact, South Africans can build their unity, but they need to do that by appreciating the fact that there are big problems that need to be resolved. So let's get a discussion internationally,
Mm.
not just internationally. Let's air our dirty linen in public, but also let's appreciate that the United States may have a bigger role to play in helping South Africa resolve most of these problems. So to me, it was a positive message. Some
Mm.
people have complained that it sounded like most of them were begging
Yeah.
and and talking about, we need your help, we need your help, we need your partnership. But again, it was a very interesting moment to raise those issues because the
Mm.
relations between South Africa and the US have deteriorated, in fact, from last year. So it
Mm.
was important in front of Trump for the South Africans to talk about their problems, but
Mm.
also the US contribution to these to the resolution of these problems. And the
Mm.
President Ramaphosa, I think, played a very interesting mediation role here. People may not like the fact that he was conciliatory, he was polite. They would have expected maybe a more confrontational, but a confrontational speech is what you do at the UN.
True.
You can say anything you want to say at the UN. But in the White House, you've been invited to the White House. you need, I think, to behave differently. Again,
Mm.
to me, this is what was restraining the president from being too reactive or to overreact to some of those accusations. And we can see from the videos and some of the cuttings is that most of it is actually fake news,
Mm.
or
True.
rather
True.
news that was misrepresented. But you
True.
don't really want to confront those issues because you want to give a bigger message of, yes, we understand your concerns.
Mm.
We
Mm.
understand that you want to push this narrative of white genocide, but let's put it in a broader context. Well, how does South Africa look now? And therefore, these other voices really played an important role, even though from the beginning everybody was saying, why is Rupert in the meeting?
Mm.
Why is Annie else there? But it was, I think, a very successful strategy to get the Gulf messaging into it. And that
True.
really warms Trump's heart.
Mm. No, true. I think it was very, very strategic from our president. Prof, I want to talk about maybe what I at least consider a missed opportunity as I was looking,
Yeah,
at these engagements at the Oval Office. The main one, obviously the white genocide issue. I think it was discussed at length, but the main one for me, was the issue of land expropriation.
yeah,
I felt to a certain extent, President Cyril Ramaphosa and his delegation failed, to make Donald Trump understand, the land expropriation bill, what it entails, what it seeks to, adjust, obviously the injustices of the past to try and recorrect that, and also to make the president of the United States understand that they have something similar in the United States. It's known as eminent domain, if I'm not mistaken,
mm,
and it's essentially where the government has the power to take privately owned land for public use, with the requirement of providing just a compensation to the owner, and not in all cases. And this is essentially what that land expropriation bill is. And I feel like there was a missed opportunity, to explain a bit further in detail, because obviously in face value, when you don't, um, analyze it, when you don't read it and don't contextualize it, it does look bad. It does look like
Yeah.
probably what happened in Zimbabwe during Robert Mugabe's administration, where white farmers were stripped of their land and they were essentially kicked out of the country.
The problem is when you're at the White House, you've been invited to a meeting of that nature. This is just an eye opener. The discussions, the bigger discussions, the bigger explanations are going to come in the more closed door sessions. So this confrontation was not this eye opener was
Mm.
not supposed to exhaust all kinds of issues on the table. So I can understand the concerns that the land issue should have been explained better. But I just want to give you a very quick response. One, there was no time for that. You see, because also the South African delegation didn't really know how much time they were going to be in the Oval Office. So it was at least as good that Trump took the leadership of, for instance, inviting the other members of the South African delegation, and then President Ramaphosa did the same. But I think the larger issue was that how much time do we have to explain all these accusations are laid against South Africa, the land appropriation, the genocide. How much time does one have? And also, these messages, this messaging has been in the public domain. South Africa has been, since January, talking about these very, very accusations and rebutting these accusations. So it's not like this information was going to be new. I think this was a photo op that turned into, I think what I said, what I describe as a very successful eye opener to the bigger discussion, to the bigger
Mm.
confrontational issues that I think were discussed in the closed door meeting. You don't know how much time you have. If you start on a lecture on what land appropriation means, maybe Trump would say, can you just get out of my office? Or maybe I know that already.
uh, uh, Prof, I want to come back to those that criticize President Cyril Ramaphosa and his approach to this engagement with Trump. Um,
Yeah.
do you think there's a lot of self overestimation coming from South Africans? There's this thinking that we are equal partners with the United States of America. There's this thinking that we are on equal footing. They need us more than we need each other equally, rather. And this meeting, do you think it put something into perspective? That, well, the reality is you're not who you are, buddy. This is not Africa. This is way bigger, and you are a small fish in a very, very big pond.
That's an excellent point, because this is an invitation that President Ramaphosa has been wanting. You remember Trump expelled ambassador, the South African ambassador, the noise about South
Ibrahim
Africa,
Rasool, yes.
Ibrahim Rasool. So there was actually the relationship, I think, was at its lowest moment. But part of getting out of that conundrum is to say we are going to go to the United States and try to explain our case. We are not a Russia, or we are not an equal to the United States. I know a lot of South Africans, I think, want to believe, as you said from the beginning, that in fact we are not going to be pushed around, and
Yeah.
Trump is not going to preach to us, especially on issues of race and all this. But I don't think that was the best attitude to take. That's why some people are saying some of those speeches came out really in a paternalistic manner, saying, we need help, we are. It was the bigger acknowledgement that the South Africa needs the U.S. More than the U.S. needs South Africa, and that is actually the reality. When we talk about trade relations, when we talk about AGOA, these are preferences that the United States has allowed African countries to export their commodities to the US without any duties. So it's
Mm,
a favor, if you could call it that way. So when Trump gets rid of AGOA, if he does in September when it expires, it is actually going to disadvantage the South African economy. So we are not actually equal to the United States. And that was the big subtext.
mm,
But the critics here are raising the issue that, in fact, South Africa should have stood more firm to say, you gain a lot from us, don't preach to us. South Africa is a big player in Africa, and it should be treated much more respectably than you have done over the last 4 months. I think that was just really going to inflame the passions, and I think it was going to be out of hand. That is why I think the Ukrainian meeting with Trump didn't go very well,
mm,
because what Zelensky was doing was responding to some of what you call unfounded accusations that the Trump people are raising. So you didn't want President Ramaphosa to be in the same kind of trap where you're being accused of things you haven't done. But if you keep going back and saying, why are you telling me all these lies?
mm,
That's not a way to hold a diplomatic conversation. I think this was
mm,
a moment where you are trying to say we need to reset the relationship. We need to re-engage with the US. This moment of entry is a very, very short moment in the discussion. The rest of the bigger questions, we'll discuss them later. I think as Ngwenya was talking about, the spokesman was saying, we didn't want to go to buy into the theatrics. We
mm.
wanted to wait for the moment when we can now focus on the substance that brought us here. And I think that's a very good distinction. We don't want to get into the political theater. We don't want to be undercut at that level of political theater. We want to be focused on the substantive issues here.
All right. I think we're going to be on that note, Prof. Thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate your time. And yeah, hope to chat again in the not so distant future.
Thank you very much.
There you go. That was Professor Gilbert, Khadiagala, international relations expert. And yeah, what do you think? What do you think about this meeting between Donald Trump and, you know, Cyril Ramaphosa and ultimately how he handled it? I think there was an expectation from some that President Cyril Ramaphosa should go to the White House, sit cross-legged in the Oval Office and give Trump the proverbial middle finger and recite, the old "keep yours and I'll keep mine" speech. Because, well, we don't need the United States of America, as I'm seeing from most that are commenting, because they're alternatives according to a lot. We have BRICS, right? But while you're busy about BRICS, maybe you you can do a bit of research. Just look at our BRICS partners, and the relationship that they have with the United States of the US, maybe with the exception of Iran and China, and you'll see the same people that you think are an alternative market, that you say, well, we should be looking more to the east than we should to the west. They are looking to the west, the same east. India, one of our biggest trading partners, a big major player in BRICS, big friend of the United States of America. Russia, you see the liking that Donald Trump has to Russia and how he wants diplomatic relations between the US and Russia to work. Brazil, major friend of of the United States of America. So what gives little South Africa, with 40% unemployment, an economy growing at 0.1%, leverage of any kind when it comes to negotiations with with the United States of America? Granted, in our passion to stand tall on the global stage, South Africans often believe we speak to giants as equals. That's who we are. We are a proud nation. And yes, perhaps we should be proud like any other nation in the world. But let's not mistake symbolism for substance. The undeniable truth is, as much as you disagree with the United States of America, as much as we condemn a lot of their actions, they are not just another player. They're a geopolitical behemoth with the power to shape or shake economies and governments. We must remain proud, yes, but we must not be naive. Whether it's in diplomacy or any sphere, self respect does matter, but so does self awareness. We're going to take a quick break. News and Views continues after this.